Every place has a story. Some stories refuse to stay buried. There is a stretch of land in Pampanga, Philippines, where the wind moves differently. Locals will tell you this without prompting. Drive along the old perimeter road at dusk, past the rusting hangars and the cracked runways, swallowed by grass, and you will feel it too. A kind of pressure behind the eyes, a sense that the silence is not empty, but listening. This is Clark Air Base. Once the largest American military installation outside the continental United States. Now, in many parts, a ruin. And the people who live near it, who work the abandoned wards of its old hospital, who walk the avenues lined with acacia trees planted a century ago, they all agree on one thing. Clark never truly emptied. To understand what haunts Clark, you must understand what Clark was. The Americans took possession of the land in 1903, just 5 years after the Spanish-American War, and named it Fort Stotzenburg. It grew slowly at first. Cavalry stables, officers' quarters, a small chapel. Then, as the world tilted toward another war, the base expanded into something monstrous, sprawling across more than 14,000 hectares of central Luzon. And then came December 8th, 1941. Only hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers descended on Clark Field. The American aircraft, lined up in neat rows on the tarmac, were destroyed before most pilots could even reach them. Hundreds died in the first wave. Hundreds more would die in the months that followed, as Clark became a Japanese-occupied airfield, and the surrounding province became part of the route now remembered as the Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands of Filipino and American soldiers were force-marched through Pampanga in the summer heat. Those who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Those who survived were interned in camps within sight of Clark's runways. The land absorbed them. The land remembers. The old Clark Air Base Hospital still stands. Pale yellow walls, empty windows. The Americans built it to handle wartime casualties, and during the Vietnam War, it became one of the busiest military hospitals in the world. Wounded men were flown in directly from Saigon, Da Nang, Hue. Many arrived already dead. Many more died in the wards within hours of landing. Ward 6 is the one nobody talks about. Caretakers will not enter it after sunset. Visitors who insist on going in describe the same thing. A wet, dragging sound from the far end of the corridor. The smell of antiseptic, decades after the last bottle was emptied. And a young man in a hospital gown, sitting upright on a bed that is no longer there, holding his stomach as if trying to keep something inside. He never speaks. He only watches you leave. After the war, Clark was rebuilt, expanded, and during the long decades of the Cold War, it became something close to a small American city. 40,000 personnel and dependents, schools, bowling alleys, a movie theater, wide palm-lined streets named after states. To the children who grew up there, it was paradise. To the Filipino workers who served on the base, it was livelihood. To everyone else in the region, it was a fortress whose secrets stayed inside its fences. Then, in June of 1991, the mountains spoke. Mount Pinatubo had been quiet for 600 years, long enough that the people living in its shadow no longer thought of it as a volcano at all. When the eruption came, it was the second largest of the 20th century. A column of ash rose 35 kilometers into the sky. Pyroclastic flows raced down the slopes. And then, as if to make the ruin complete, a typhoon arrived at the exact same moment. Ash fell on Clark like gray snow. It mixed with the rain and became cement. Roofs collapsed under the weight. Hangars buckled. The Americans had already evacuated most of the base in the days before, but those who remained spoke of a darkness at noon, of the air thick enough to chew, of an unending sound like the world grinding its teeth. When the ash finally settled, Clark Air Base, the great fortress, was buried, and the Americans, after negotiations with the Philippine government, simply left. By 1992, the flag came down. 89 years of occupation ended in silence. What they left behind was a city of ghosts. For years after the Americans departed, Clark sat largely abandoned. And, in those years, the stories began to multiply. Pilots flying small aircraft over the old runways at night reported their instruments spinning. Radio chatter in English voices, calling in landings for squadrons that no longer existed. One Filipino pilot in 1997 described hearing a clear American voice request emergency clearance. He looked down at the dark runway. He saw landing lights, 2 perfect rows of them blinking in sequence. When he radioed the tower at the new civilian airport that had taken over part of the base, they told him there were no lights on that strip. There had not been for 6 years. He looked again. The lights were still there, and something was descending toward them. He pulled up and never flew that route again. The base was reborn in part as the Clark Freeport Zone. Hotels rose. A casino opened. The old officers' quarters became guest houses. But the haunted geography of Clark could not be developed away. It was layered too deeply. Spanish ground, American ground, Japanese ground, volcanic ground, every layer holding its own dead. Security guards working the night shift at the old fuel depots describe footsteps in heavy boots circling them in the dark. When they shine their flashlights, the footsteps stop. When they turn them off, the steps resume. Always at the same pace, always closing in. The old Lily Hill, once a residential area for senior officers, is now overgrown and largely off-limits. Caretakers there speak of a woman in a 1950s-style dress who knocks on the doors of houses that no longer have residents. She knocks 3 times, always 3. If you open the door, she asks, in perfect American English, whether her husband has come home from the flight yet. The records show that on July 12, 1957, a B-57 bomber crashed shortly after takeoff from Clark. The pilot's wife was waiting at their quarters on Lily Hill. She was told the news that evening. She is, by all reasonable accounts, still waiting. But the most disturbing stories at Clark come from the area near the old chapel and the unmarked ground behind it. During the construction boom of the early 2000s, workers excavating for a new road uncovered bones, many bones, not in coffins, not in formation, simply pressed into the earth, layer upon layer. Some were in Japanese military uniform fragments. Some wore the rotted remains of American boots. Some were clearly Filipino civilians, hands still bound behind their backs with wire that had not fully rusted away. The dig was halted. The bones, according to local accounts, were quietly reinterred. The road was rerouted. The workers who had been on that site began to share dreams, the same dream. They were walking in a long line under a hot sun, and they could not stop, and behind them was the sound of bayonets being fixed, and ahead of them was Clark, always Clark, never any closer. 3 of those workers never returned to the job. One was found dead in his home in San Fernando. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. He was 31 years old. Today, Clark functions. Tourists land at the international airport built on its old runways. Conventions fill its hotels. Children laugh in its parks. And yet, ask any longtime employee, any janitor in the older buildings, any guard who has walked the perimeter at 3 in the morning, and they will give you the same careful answer. Some places do not belong to the present. The Spanish colonized it. The Americans built it. The Japanese bled it. The volcano buried it. And through all of it, the dead remained. layered into the soil like sediment in a riverbed. You can pave over Clark. You can light it up with neon. You can rename every street. But when the wind moves through the acacia trees at dusk, and the runway lights flicker on for no reason, and a woman in a faded dress knocks 3 times on an empty door, you will understand what every Filipino who lives in Pampanga already knows. Clark Air Base never closed. It only changed shifts. If you have ever felt something watching you in a place that should be empty, leave a single in the comments. The Archivist reads them all, and some of you, I suspect, have walked these grounds yourselves. Sleep well, if you can.